Good evening. This is Raul, and tonight I am recording an episode here to reminisce a little bit about my favorite gaming magazine from back in the day. So, I think what I'm going to do is a little bit of a series here where I'll be going through. I don't know if I'll be able to get through each issue that came out, but I wanted to at least go through some of the issues of Gamefan or Die Hard Game Fan magazine. And so there was a lot of different video game magazines back in the day. And, back then, this is how we got our gaming information was through these magazines here. And it was, because back then, obviously, we didn't have the internet or what it is today. And so we relied a lot on these gaming magazines to give us the information we were wanting, because as we were growing up, and all, we were starved for information, right, for on video games and all. And this is what we had back in the day. And so I had been reading gaming magazines since pretty much around the time that I started getting into gaming. And there was a few magazines back in the mid to late 80s that I started getting into, and I don't quite recall some of their names. There was one in particular that I remember we used to get, but I don't remember the name of it. But then there were some of the other ones that were starting to become popular, like EGM, Game Pro, and to some extent, I read some Nintendo Power through friends. And then also because I was a Sega kid, we had Sega Visions, which was sort of our version of Nintendo Power. It didn't quite blow up as much as Nintendo Power did, but it was still cool though, right? That we had something for us Sega fans. But eventually, though, we came across this magazine, Die Hard Game Fan. I don't quite recall how we came across it. I think me and my brother just one time were out at a grocery mart and all. We saw this magazine, and it definitely stands out or stood out from other magazines at the time because the art style to it and the layouts and the reviews and all were definitely out there. And it was a very fun gaming magazine. And, if you've never heard anything about Die Hard Game Fan, just search for them on YouTube. And there's a lot of videos on there that goes into the history of this company. Yeah, it's pretty outlandish and wildish and all just some of the stories that are of some of the editors. I used to work there and all, and this, also from the editor-in-chief, Dave Halverson. It's pretty funny. But all this to say, though, is that I really enjoyed this magazine, though, back in the day. And so just wanted to go through these issues here. Unfortunately, I don't have the original issues. I had quite a bit of them back in the day, but I want to say that at one point, many years ago, I was moving and I was just trying to get rid of some stuff. And so I had this whole stack of magazines from GameFan, and I think I didn't know what to do with them. So I put them in a box along with other magazines. And I want to say I dropped them off at a Goodwill and just left them there. And so I never knew whatever ended up happening to them, or if they even took them or threw them away. I don't know. And oh, it kills me and all, just because, it would have been a cool stuff to have, held on to. But, just back in the day, I was just trying to get rid of some stuff and all, and felt at the time I didn't have any need for these, gaming magazines. But what I'm doing right now, though, is I'm going to go through them here on the Internet Archive. And so it'll still give us an idea, right, of what these gaming magazines were. So I didn't actually start getting into this magazine until I think it was the third issue. So we're going back to number 1 here. So this is the very first one here that they did. And so I'm not too familiar with this issue, so I thought it'd be fun to just kind of scroll through here. And I'll be reading, probably I'll try to read the editor's comments, and then maybe some reviews and all. Just kind of skip through the pages, and so you get an idea what it looks like. But this is the layout here for the magazine. And so here we got the, Bonk, Mario, and Sonic, the mascots at the time for the TurboGrafx 16, the Super Nintendo, and the Sega Genesis. And we also had a guy there in the blue sort of outfit, if you'll say, with a monitor for a head. And his name was Monitor, if I remember right. And he was sort of the mascot of GameFan. They had like a kind of like an ongoing comic strip, the Adventures of Monitor or something like that it was called. And, they were kind of fun to watch or read and all. But yeah, he was sort of the mascot, though, for the magazine. But yeah, this is the very first issue here. So let's see. So it looks like we got some first Sega CD reviews for Wonder Dog and Thunderstorm FX. SNK's 102 Mega Shock of Art of Fighting preview. The Neo Geo games with, the high megabit rates. That was pretty intense back then. And then some previews of Sega's Revenge of Shinobi 2, Ninja Gaiden 4, and Batman Returns. 40 pages of reviews, and Yuzo Koshiro speaks out. Good stuff. So some of the names of these games and all, they ended up changing and all. But see, we start off here with an ad for the Turbo Duo. So the Turbo Duo the Turbo 16 was starting to fail. And so what NEC ended up doing was putting both together the main system along with the CD add-on and call it the Turbo Duo. So it was a nifty piece of hardware. So, for anybody that might have gotten it, that would have been a pretty cool thing to have. Let's see. And then you got your table of contents here. First issue, so it's pretty light on stuff. Oh, piece of hair there. And so the editorial zone, so I'll go over this here. So, welcome to the first issue of Gamefan magazine, designed for the enthusiast gamer. You'll find a fresh new format that cuts right through the garb and goes to what we all want. Good games, a lot of graphics, and reliable information from the US and abroad. Let me explain how things work around here. First of all, you'll notice that we like just about everything we covered. There are two reasons for this. Number one, each review page is done by a game player who prefers that type of game. To get a more objective view, you can go to the viewpoint and see what Skid and Brody have to say. Number two, if we do preview a game, it's just to let you know that it's coming and has potential. Any info we get about the game from the maker will be shown here. Then hopefully we can review it before 1 to 2 months it comes out, so you can plan ahead knowing what's good. Also, each game is rated in comparison to others on that system. What we want is to bring you all the quality that gaming has to offer while benefiting the gaming industry as well. In the second issue of Gamefan, we will be adding our most wanted top 10 category. As a subscriber, by writing in your current favorite and most wanted choices, you will earn points. Once you reach a certain goal, you will receive free game-related merchandise according to your total. Not only does this get you free stuff, but it lets the makers know what you like and what you would like to see. You really can make a difference. Makes sense, doesn't it? In closing, I would like to say, I hope you like what we have done in this issue. Our next issue will have more new categories and will, of course, be thicker as our advertisers and expanded coverage. And since we are a new magazine, we'll be going to back to give you our opinions on some recent games that got unfair reviews elsewhere. Somebody gave Alicia Dragoon a 4 and set me off. Feel free to write us with all your questions and opinions. This is your forum, so feel free to use it. Remember, we're all gamers too. We listen. See you next month. Signed, eStorm. So, little heads up on this magazine here is, and this is why I really ended up enjoying them, is they're definitely game fans, right? I mean, as the name of the magazine states. And they did have a bit of a Sega bias, though, which I will say for me back then, I really appreciated it just because, again, I was a Sega kid, and they really ended up covering and not only that, but also giving a lot of accolades to a lot of Sega Genesis games that, weren't the best reviewed out, in other places. So, for example, like it says there, Alicia Dragoon, I don't recall what that game might have scored back in the day, but it's a really good game. But I just don't remember it getting a lot of coverage. So I don't doubt too much what he's saying there. And so, again, I'm glad that we had a magazine back then that, definitely gave Sega its props, because I feel like Sega just got kind of overlooked back then a lot. Even though the Sega Genesis did pretty good, there was a lot of games on there aside from Sonic, right, that I just feel weren't really praised the way they should have. And so I'm glad this magazine was able to pick up the slack on that at least. And it's not that they didn't give Nintendo their dues or other systems, but there was a bit of a Sega bias to it and all. But like I said, right, and all, it's what led me to discover a lot of cool games on the Sega Genesis and even on the Super Nintendo, because they also put spotlight on some more underrated games. But let's see. So here's our viewpoint section. And so let's see. Looks like what games did they review here? Green Dog got a 76% and a 67. Let's see, super high impact. So I'm not going to go through all of these here, but again, I'm just kind of scrolling down here. Wonder Dog on the Sega CD. They used to rave about this game quite a bit, and I played it, afterwards, and it's a fun platformer. But okay, so here's a good example. They used to rave about this game quite a bit. Wonder Dog by JVC/Core, and it's a fun platformer and all, and definitely it's I had a good time with it, the bit that I've played of it and all. I think that if you are into old school platforming, it is worth a shot. But here's an example of a game that pretty much got overlooked everywhere, and yet here they are giving it a 99% and a 98%. I don't know if I'd go that high, but like I said, it definitely called out to this game here, right, that I otherwise would have ignored. Let's see, I'll just kind of go really quick here too. I think what Skid said was, Core has done it again. Wonder Dog has everything I look for in an action game. Great graphics and animation, scaling and rotation, great music, and not of all, Wonder Dog is a long game with just the right amount of difficulty. Bring on part 2, which we never got. But yeah, I mean, like I said, that's a good example, right, of kind of what we're getting at with this magazine. But they gave Thunder Force 4, which was Lightning Force, a 98% and a 95%. Let's see, they gave Alien 3 a 95% and an 89. Global Gladiators was a decent little action game for the Sega Genesis, and I believe also on the Super Nintendo, but that was a 92% and a 95. And let's see, what else stands out here? Prince of Persia, what was that on? That on the Super Nintendo? I think so, yeah. But they gave it a 90% and a 97. So, kind of gives you an idea, right, of what we're looking at here with these, with these guys. Oh, man. Yeah, I remember reading through these reviews. They gave Nutopia 2 on the TurboGrafx an 85% and an 89. That's a pretty good game. Gate of Thunder on the Turbo CD, an 89% and a 95%. So, yeah, some good stuff was coming out during this time. So this would have been, I believe, 1993, I think, when this magazine started coming out. And then here we have an interview with Yuzo Koshiro. So he's the musician behind ActRaiser 1 and 2, Revenge of Shinobi, Streets of Rage, Beyond Oasis. And more recently, he's the behind also the great shooter that just came out, Eartheon. Right now, it's available on PC, and it'll be coming out on the all the modern consoles soon. And it's just cool that an old developer from back in the day, right, Yuzo Koshiro. So again, he was mainly known for his music, but I believe he dabbles in game design. I mean, his company Agent, he seems to be behind like the creating of the game, not just the music. But yeah, it's just cool. Here he is back in the day, right? When he was really in the spotlight, and it's just cool that he came out with a game recently. I think that's awesome. And then we had our Hocus Pocus section here, which just gives some cheat codes. And so they broke it up into different sections here, right, representing the different systems. So here's the Sega sector. And so as you can see, right, Sega's kind of in the forefront here, where most other magazines, they probably would have had Nintendo. But again, just, there was a bit of a Sega bias to this magazine. But here it looks like they go over Green Dog, which Green Dog was all right. I remember re-rented it one time. I didn't think too highly of it. There's this game here, Gods. I never did play this game, but it was made by Mindscape. And then here's Wonder Dog. And so back then with the Sega CD, it was just always cool seeing the animated intros at the time. Again, with the new CD technology, because let's see. So this was, I'm pretty sure this was in 1993. The Sega CD came out, was it 1992, I believe? And so it was just cool seeing some of the stuff here where, we're starting to see cinematics, cutscenes, and all that, and voice acting as well too. A lot of the stuff was pretty basic back then and all, but it was no denying, right, and all that it was still pretty cool initially, right, when we were starting to see this stuff. But yeah, Wonder Dog. It's a nice looking game. It has some cool scrolling. The sprites are really detailed and colorful and all. And so yeah, it's a fun little game. Again, it's they really rave about this game and all, which I think is cool. But I wouldn't say I like it as much as they did. But again, if I hadn't really read their review or seen how much they praised it, this game would have pretty much gone on under a lot of people's radar. And of course, the amazing Thunder Force 4, again known as Lightning Force here. Yeah, just a great game. And then Landstalker. So they were really raving about Landstalker. And I believe here is, they were talking about it. It says, look for a review next month. But I think it was still in Japan at the time. But yeah, the game was, slated to come over here. And so they were really excited about it. And that's another game, again, that I think Landstalker is amazing. And I actually prefer it slightly over A Link to the Past. But again, a lot of magazines just didn't really give it its time and all. And I get it, right? And also Nintendo games were just more popular and all that. But like I said, I'm just glad that this magazine gave some props, to some games, right? And all that would have gone under the radar. But then there's Predator 2, which is kind of a top-down action shooting game. I played it a little bit. It's all right. Alien 3 on the Sega Genesis. This was okay. They really raved about this game here. I didn't mind the one on the Sega Genesis, but this is one actually where I do prefer the Super Nintendo version more. Global Gladiators. So kind of an odd little game, but where you're these two kids and you have like a kind of like a slime gun, and it's a action platformer, and it's cool. I mean, it was a fun little platforming game. And then this is what Batman Returns. Is that on the? I think they were talking about no, that's the Sega Genesis version. Let's see, and then Ninja Gaiden 4. I think maybe that was only in Japan. I don't recall that game coming out here. But then there's a Magical Troll, again, another game that I believe was only in Japan only. So diehard game fans, a little bit of history on them. What I understand is that, so Dave Halverson, he had a store where they would import games and video game merchandise and whatnot. And then eventually they, branched out to get, to this magazine. But because they were specializing in imported games and all, they had a lot of connections with Japan as far as the video game scene over there, and also a lot of interest in there. So you do see a lot of coverage here from like import games and all, which I didn't really see that back then from a lot of the other magazines back then. And so that's another thing that I really liked about this magazine, because it would show me what the Japanese scene was going on over there, which was, it was different in a lot of ways from what we had going on over here. So it's kind of cool, right, that they would give us some insight on a lot of these Japanese games. Super High Impact. I don't know if I ever played this, but there was a lot of arcade sports games that were coming out back then. I kind of miss those. We don't really get those anymore because we were still getting them up until the 6th generation, maybe a little bit into the 7th generation, but then after that, we just never really got anything. And then all we really get nowadays is just, Madden and the NBA 2K series or the MLB, the shows. So, there's really not more diversity as far as sports games go, which is kind of unfortunate because a lot of these arcadey, more sports games were just really fun. But then we got Biohazard Battle. This is a shooting game on the Sega Genesis. I haven't played this game. And it's on a lot of compilations for the Sega Genesis, but yeah, I just haven't gotten around to play it. And then they have their little preview section here. So here we're looking at the Super Shinobi is what it was being called back then. So it ended up being Shinobi 3, The Return of the Ninja Master. But so I'm not quite sure on the full story on this, but the game was released fairly early. And but then later, because they reviewed it, but then it got canceled, and then they redid part of the game, and then they re-released it maybe a year later or so, and they reviewed it again. So it was kind of weird, but this is like the first early version that was coming out. And but yeah, ended up being a really cool game. But you'll see as I go through the different issues here and all, like they review it, and then like I said, that version got canceled or whatever, or they went and fixed some things on it, and then they ended up coming out with the version that we know now. But then, we're starting to talk about Sonic 2. So let's see. They say, I've got one thing to say about Sonic 2. You're not going to believe it. We're talking major speed. Sonic and Tails flies on screens everywhere this November. Get ready for Sonic Tuesday. So let me back up again. I think I was saying that this is from 1993. So we're talking about Sonic 2. So this is going to be a 1992, actually. So my bad. So this would have been this, 1992 issue. And then looks like they're talking about their game Musha, I believe. Oh no, Robo LSD. Yeah, on the Sega CD. Yeah, that was a great game. This game right here. It's kind of like a pseudo sequel or part of the universe of the Musha series or LSD series from developer Compile. They've done a lot of cool shooters. But let's see. And then they're talking about sports talk, Joe Montana football. So that's where we started getting like commentary in our sports games. And it was pretty revolutionary what they were able to do on the Sega Genesis cart. And let's see, and then Wolfchild. Core was just pumping out a bunch of cool, games back in the day. And some of them were good, some of them were not as good. But yeah, they definitely had a lot of content back then. Okay, so now the Super Nintendo section was called Planet SNES. Let's see. So here they're talking about, looks like a Marvel game. What is this? Spider-Man, X-Men. I never did play that game. What is it? What was it called again? Doesn't really say. But it was a game that kind of combined Spider-Man and the X-Men. Super Buster Bros. I will say that during the stretch right here, not that the Super Nintendo didn't have a lot of good games, they definitely did, but it was kind of one of the more quieter periods during the Super Nintendo, because I feel like they started off really strong, and then in the middle of their lifetime, they were good. Like I said, they had good games, but it wasn't nothing really that, at least for me personally, right, where there was some really amazing games, but then later on its lifetime, it just ended with a bang, right? And all. But for me personally, I feel like this is kind of one of the more quieter times. But they did have like the Star Wars game, right, which ended up coming out with the trilogy of the original movies, and those games are fun, really hard, but they're great though. So this is super Star Wars. Let's see. And so I love the layout to this and all. And now their quality really improves, but as you're kind of seeing already, their layouts they had some kind of technology where they can get some really, at the time, high resolution screenshots. And so they would kind of go crazy with the layouts and all, right, where they had a lot of gorgeous screenshots on the pages and all. And they got really creative with the layouts. The only problem with that, though, is that, especially like in these earlier issues, is that it's kind of hard to read the text sometimes on certain parts, just because the color usage that they use for the text and everything going on in the layout that they have of their pages, it kind of doesn't mesh very well. But it was still cool, though. So see, like here, they have the whole page or the whole section there of that stage there. Let's see, but we're talking about Prince of Persia here. Animation on that game was really something else back in the day. And then Harley's Humongous Adventure. I think this is a game they used like the claymation, I believe. The King of Monsters. So for those that didn't know or don't know, so Neo Geo was quite the powerhouse back in the day as far as like graphics goes. It was considered a 24-bit system where the Genesis and Super Nintendo were 16-bit, and so their games were really impressive. But the Neo Geo and the games themselves were pretty expensive, and it was wasn't the most readily available system either. So I mean, I never knew anybody that had a Neo Geo. And so, I mean, if you had one, you were probably pretty well off, But the nice thing, though, is that there was this company called Takara, I believe is how you pronounce that. And so they ended up porting a lot of games to the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. And their ports were pretty decent across both systems, the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, that it gave you a good taste of what the actual Neo Geo's games were. So here's the port, right, that they did of King of Monsters on the Super Nintendo. I've never played this version and all, but I just know that some of their other games that they did for mainly the Sega Genesis is where I played them, but I played a handful of their ports on the Super Nintendo, and they did a pretty comparable job, right, from what the experience was on the Neo Geo. Let's see. Phalanx. I think that was like some kind of a shooter. Super Double Dragon. I don't remember much of this game. I remember Gamefan kind of raving about it, but I didn't really see too much about it elsewhere. Out of This World. This game is. I want to go through this game. So back then they started doing what was called like cinematic platformers or whatever they were called, but it's where it kind of started with the Prince of Persia, where they're platforming, but the movements and all are more realistic and the game is slower pace, and so there's puzzles involved, and also it has some action but it's more limited. And so that's kind of what this out of This World game was. And the animations to them and all, because they were doing like cutscenes also that had like some polygon almost looking effects, and it was really impressive at the time. They're kind of difficult games, and they're kind of like trial by error games where you're going to die a lot as you try to figure out how to get past a certain section. But they were really creative, really fun. Again, never played. I played a bit. I've played it. I just haven't gone too far into it, but I definitely want to try to play it at some point because they were pretty cool games. Because there was this one and then another one, Heart of the Alien. I believe that one came out on the Sega CD, and I'm sure we'll come across it later in the later issues. But then there was Soul Blazer by Enix on the Super Nintendo. It was an action RPG. Never played this one, but one that has my attention, though, that I might want to try to play at some point. The Super Nintendo just had a lot of great RPGs and action RPGs as well, too. Oh, oops. Let's see. Super Professional Baseball. Yeah, Super Nintendo did have a lot of cool baseball games, like also like the Ken Griffey one and this one. Let's see, F1 Grand Prix, some kind of a racing game. I don't recall that one. And then we go into the previous section. Let's see. So they're talking about Fatal Fury coming out to your Super Nintendo. That would end up being a decent port. Batman Returns was a beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo. Looks like it's got announced there that it was coming out that fall. That's a pretty cool game. And that's just some other games there that nothing too much of note. Oh, Cybernator, actually. This one's Cybernator here. Let's see. And then Turbo Tune. So this is the TurboGrafx 16 section. And they gave TurboGrafx some props too also, which is pretty cool because, again, the TurboGrafx was kind of, it was a system that it had some popularity here in the States, but nothing too major. And it wasn't until the later years, right, and all that, it started getting a following. But they were giving it some coverage here. So some game here for I believe for the CD, the Shapeshifter. I'm not sure what that is. Dead Moon. I'm not sure what that is. Utopia 2. I've played a bit of part 1, and their cool game is, well, at least the first one is. It's very much like Zelda, but done really well, really colorful graphics, and also what I played of it and all. It seems like a pretty cool game, if you like Zelda. Prince of Persia, Gate of Thunder. This game, cool shooter, kick-ass rock music. I haven't beaten it, but yeah, very cool game though. They got a version of Atomic Robo Kid, which was also an early Sega Genesis game. Ninja Gaiden. Ninja Gaiden's coming up a lot here. I didn't know there were so many versions of Ninja Gaiden. Looks like in Japan only. New Adventure Island. And let's see, for previews, what do we got here? I think this is Airzonk, I believe is what this game is. Let's see. Oh, Cyberbonk. It was like some kind of a shooter, if I recall right. But then we go into the Neo Geo Savage Amusement. So, as the name says, the Neo Geo section. So there was World Heroes, which is, the Neo Geo just had tons of fighting games. World Heroes is just another one. So it looks like they're making an announcement that is coming out. And then Art of Fighting, that was another one too. Art of Fighting had some really cool scaling effects for back then. And, for all the fighting games that Neo Geo had, at least for me personally, a lot of the fighting games were really great, or they ended up becoming really great. But none of them just had the feel of Street Fighter 2, though. And I think like Neo Geo was just, or the SNK, the company behind Neo Geo, like almost like they were trying to replicate the success of Street Fighter 2, and they never could, but they ended up making their own success though, and sort of deviating themselves from what Capcom was doing with Street Fighter 2, and they ended up finally getting their fan base and all, because their fighting games are really good. I just felt that they just weren't quite on the level of Street Fighter 2. Ninja Commando. It was like some kind of an action game on the Neo Geo. Baseball Stars. So the Neo Geo did have some cool sports or arcade sports games. So this is one of them. Last Resort. So this is a pretty cool 2D shooter. Robo Army. I'm not too familiar with that game. But then also hands-on portable. So they talk a little bit about some of the handheld systems back then. So there's like the Atari Lynx and the Sega Game Gear. Looks like they're talking about a port of Streets of Rage. The Lynx, that's a system I'm not familiar to also. I want to emulate it at some point and just get a taste of what the library was all about. Because the system was pretty powerful at the time for being a handheld. But, the Game Boy just really took off just because it was cheaper. The batteries lasted longer, even though the graphics didn't look as good. But those first two things that I mentioned, it just made the system just a lot more popular. And I think also because of Nintendo's IPs and all too also. But at the time, though, the hardware behind the Game Gear and the Lynx was pretty impressive, though. And so then you have your other stuff section here. And so what this is just really that, like they call it other stuff. And a lot of it would just be, rumors, things that they had heard, games that were being in development, things of that sort. And yeah, it was kind of cool sometimes to go back to some of these old magazines and some of the rumors that were, they were talking about back then, and, to see if they ended up panning out or if they didn't. I mean, just kind of like we have it nowadays, right? We get rumors and leaks and all that. Well, the same thing was happening back then. It's just that the spread of the news was just a lot slower, right? Because, again, it was, we didn't have the internet back then as the way it is now. But this is like our little sections, because a lot of magazines had a section like this. And, it's just kind of fun back to go to. It's like, oh, did that ever pan out? And some of them did. Some of them, they were right on the money. But other times, not as much. Or, things got canceled and whatnot. And, but yeah, it's just always kind of fun to, read through some of these here. And so then they just have some screenshots here, some other random stuff. And so again, back then, all we had was screenshots to go off on, right? And so I remember looking at things like, if you see that motorcycle game there, kind of over on the right, where it says ISO ha at Japanese arcades is Suzuka, or also ha, oh God, I wasn't reading that right. Also ha at Japanese arcades is Suzuka 8 hours. And, you were looking at the screenshots only of that, right? And we're like, oh my God, that looks amazing. And then we have pictures here of the final fight on the Sega CD, which ended up being a really good port. Batman Returns on the Sega CD. The game itself, Batman Returns, it's okay, but the Sega CD version has some pretty cool Batmobile levels. That the graphics were pretty impressive at the time, the scaling and all. Just very hard game, though. But then they're talking about Golden Axe 3, which was supposedly going to come out for the Mega CD, but that didn't really happen. And then they have their graveyard section where they talk about some older games. So here they're talking about Super EDF, which was a shooter, I believe, for the Super Nintendo, I believe. Let's see. Was it the Super Nintendo? I'm pretty sure it was. I don't think it really says. And then Granada X, which was on the Sega Genesis. That only seemed like that was, this would have been in 1992, and Granada, that just came out like in 1990, I believe. And so we're already talking about it in the graveyard section. And so then it had a section here where kind of showing the schedule for games that are coming out. And also if you wanted to subscribe to the magazine. What was it back then? 12 issues for just $24.99. The end. That's funny. So yeah, it's their first issue, so this one's pretty basic, not a whole lot to it. but the later issues definitely get, they get more reviewers and all. And so, from what I understand, Dave Halverson, who was the editor in chief, um, and basically the main person behind this magazine. So you'll later on in the later magazines, there's a name E Storm, who is what he basically who was credited at the beginning as far as writing the editorial. Um, right? Yeah, E Storm. Okay, so right there. And what I understand is that, so again, because you can see like they have like their character designs, right, for Skid and Brody. What I understand is, so there was Dave Halverson, which you'll see his name later on. I don't know if his name is on here. Um, no, so there's some other people here, but basically, what I understand, Dave Halverson was actually E Storm and also Skid. I believe. I'm pretty sure it was the same person, and I believe also the postmeister, who's going to come in later issues. And he was. They would have like a letter section, and so they had a caricature, right, called the postmeister, and he looked kind of a, again, there was a, what was his name, Wolfinger, I think, but he was like the artist that did a lot of the drawings for these, for them. And is that his name? Editor in chief Ernest Storm. No, that was Dave Howerson. And that's the thing about him, right? He's a bit shady. So, he used to use like a lot of aliases. But basically they got an artist. I think his name was Terry Wolfinger or something. And he ended up doing like, basically, as they ended up getting new writers and reviewers and all, they would have like their own caricature that they would, that this artist would draw out. And, it was very much, what I loved about this magazine, that it was very much made for like my age range at the time, which I would have been 12, back then, when this magazine was coming out. So it was basically a teenager. And so it was really written for like someone like me, right? And all, which is why I ended up getting into the magazine a lot. I dug the different characters, that they would use, right, for their aliases on the, for the reviewers and all. And, it was just a fun magazine and all, and you'll kind of see, right, the later issues. Again, this is just the first one, but yeah, a lot of fun to read through this magazine, and I felt this would be a cool little thing to do, just so I can have him sort of archived for myself, if anything, and then if anybody else is watching this, and also you kind of get an experience of what these magazines are all, or, were all about back then. Yeah, cool stuff. And they were just fun magazines and all, and it's how we used to get our information back in the day. But yeah, so that's Gamefan Volume 1. Well, hope you enjoyed that little trip down memory lane with me, and we'll see you in the next one.